History often paints its grandest tales with the brushstrokes of kings and conquerors, those whose names echo through time, immortalized in stone and scroll. But what if the truth was far more intriguing? What if the real architects of power weren't the rulers who sat on thrones, but the silent figures who stood just beyond the light of history's spotlight? Picture the whispers in the halls of ancient palaces, the rustle of parchment in dimly lit chambers, the quiet decisions made by those who wore no crowns but held the keys to empires. These were the eunuchs who navigated the treacherous currents of court politics, the scribes who shaped the narratives of entire dynasties, the advisors who turned mere mortals into legends. Their stories are the hidden threads woven into the tapestry of history, and today we pull them into the light. Think of the most powerful empires you've ever read about, the sprawling domains of China's emperors, the opulent courts of Persia, the intricate bureaucracies of Rome. Behind every decree, every war, every rise and fall, there were unseen hands guiding fate. These servants weren't just footnotes, they were master strategists, cultural gatekeepers, and sometimes the true power behind the throne. A eunuch might control access to the emperor, deciding who could whisper in his ear. A scribe could immortalize a ruler's glory or erase their failures with the stroke of a brush. An advisor could turn the tide of succession with a single well-placed suggestion. Their influence was subtle, but its impact was anything but small. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a revelation about how power really works. Across centuries and continents, these silent architects shaped the world in ways we're only beginning to understand. They prove that history isn't just made by those who shout the loudest, but by those who listen, observe, and act from the shadows. So join us as we step into the corridors of ancient power, where the servants were the true strategists and the throne was just the stage. By the time we're done, you'll never look at history the same way again. The question isn't who sat on the throne, it's who truly held the reins. To understand the power of eunuchs in ancient courts, we must first grasp the paradox of their position. Stripped of traditional family ties and often seen as outsiders, they were paradoxically entrusted with the most intimate access to rulers precisely because they lacked dynastic ambitions. In the forbidden city of Ming Dynasty China, eunuchs weren't just servants, they were the emperor's eyes, ears, and often his voice. They filtered petitions, controlled the imperial seal, and decided which messages reached the throne. A well-placed whisper from a eunuch could make or break a minister's career, sway military campaigns, or redirect the flow of state wealth. Their influence wasn't just bureaucratic, it was psychological. Without heirs or external loyalties, they were bound entirely to the emperor's favor, a double-edged sword that made them both fiercely devoted and ruthlessly pragmatic. Nowhere was this duality more striking than in the Ottoman Empire, where the chief black eunuch, known as the Kisler Agassi, governed the imperial harem and served as the sultan's personal confidant. This wasn't merely a domestic role, it was a political powerhouse. The harem was a nexus of dynastic strategy, where the future of the empire was shaped through alliances, heirs, and rivalries. The eunuch who controlled its gates effectively controlled the royal family's private world. Some, like the legendary Suleiman Agha, amassed fortunes and commanded respect that rivaled viziers. Yet their power always carried fragility. A single misstep could lead to execution, as their existence depended entirely on the ruler's whim. The Byzantine Empire offers perhaps the most surprising examples of eunuchs defying expectations. Take Narsus, the elderly eunuch who, at nearly 70, was sent by Emperor Justinian to reclaim Italy from the Goths. While the famed General Belisarius had struggled for years, Narsus succeeded within months, not through brute force, but by mastering the art of diplomacy and logistics. He negotiated with rival factions, secured supply lines, and outmaneuvered enemies who underestimated him precisely because of his status. His victories proved that eunuchs weren't just administrators, they could be brilliant tacticians when given the chance. Then there's Zheng He, the Ming Dynasty's legendary admiral. A eunuch since childhood, he commanded the largest wooden fleet ever assembled, sailing from China to East Africa decades before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. His voyages weren't just displays of power, they were masterclasses in soft diplomacy, establishing trade networks and cultural ties that reshaped the Indian Ocean world. Yet Zheng's story also reveals the precariousness of eunuch influence. After his patron emperor died, rivals destroyed his records and dismantled his fleet, fearing the sheer scale of a eunuch's legacy. What made eunuchs so effective and so feared was their ability to operate in the gaps of rigid social hierarchies. Neither noble nor commoner, they moved between worlds with a fluidity others couldn't match. They knew secrets, spoke truths others dared not utter, and wielded influence without the constraints of family or faction. But their power was always borrowed, never owned. In the end, their stories remind us that history's most enduring influence often comes not from those who claim authority, but from those who master the art of navigating its shadows. If knowledge is power, then scribes were the unseen engineers of ancient empires. In the sun-baked courtyards of Mesopotamia, where cuneiform first pressed meaning into clay, these literate elites didn't just record history, they curated it. A single wedge-shaped stroke could legitimize a king's divine right or condemn a rival to obscurity. Take the Babylonian scribes who etched Hammurabi's laws onto stone pillars. Their work wasn't passive transcription, it was a deliberate act of statecraft, framing justice as the ruler's prerogative while omitting the messy realities of enforcement. Egypt elevated this craft to an art form. Temple scribes didn't merely tally grain harvests, they sculpted reality itself. When Pharaoh Ramses II faced the Hittites at Kadesh, his scribes transformed a near-disastrous stalemate into a glorious victory on papyrus. By emphasizing chariot charges and divine intervention while minimizing casualties, they turned military ambiguity into propaganda gold. Even more audacious were the royal genealogists, who could discreetly adjust family trees to erase inconvenient ancestors or insert divine lineage where none existed. A well-placed omission could spare a dynasty's reputation, while an added hieroglyph might sanctify a usurper's claim. But the true dark art of scribal power lay in taxation. In a world where most couldn't read their own tax assessments, scribes held life and death authority. A Sumerian merchant might bribe a scribe to lighten his tribute to the temple, while an Egyptian farmer could find his harvest overstated and his family starving if he crossed the wrong official. The Roman tabularii, keepers of census rolls, wielded similar clout. By tweaking property records, they could shield allies from imperial levies or bankrupt political enemies. Emperor Augustus himself relied on these scribes to consolidate power, using their archives to track and tax every corner of the empire. Perhaps no story captures scribal influence better than the Roman Emperor Claudius. Mocked as a stammering scholar, he surrounded himself with freedman scribes who effectively governed the empire. Narcissus and Pallas, once enslaved clerks, became his closest advisors, drafting laws, managing finances, and even negotiating with foreign envoys. Senators seethed as these pen pushers dictated policy, proving that fluency with a stylus could outweigh noble blood, yet their fall was as swift as their rise. When Claudius died, his successors purged his scribal network. a reminder that those who control information walk a razor's edge between influence and expendability. The legacy of scribes reveals a timeless truth. Those who document the present shape how the future remembers it. Whether etching laws into stone or tallying tribute on papyrus, they were the ghostwriters of history, scripting narratives that served power or subtly undermined it. Their tools were simple, a reed pen, a wax tablet, but their impact echoes across millennia, proving that the mightiest dynasties were built not just on swords, but on the silent authority of those who held the pen. Consider the Vizier not as a mere advisor, but as the hidden architect of empires. In ancient Egypt, Imhotep wasn't just Pharaoh Djoser's right hand. He revolutionized architecture, medicine, and governance so profoundly that he was later worshipped as a god. His step pyramid at Saqqara didn't just honor his king. It announced the Vizier's role as civilization's engineer. Centuries later, the Ottoman Grand Viziers operated with even sharper cunning. Men like Sokollu Mehmed Pasha didn't merely implement Sultan Suleiman's decrees. They drafted them, negotiated with foreign powers, and even orchestrated royal successions. When Suleiman's heir, Selim II, took the throne, it was Sokollu who truly governed, steering the empire through wars and treaties while the Sultan indulged in palace pleasures. China's chancellors wielded power with a different kind of precision. Lai Si, the ruthless strategist behind Qin Shi Huang's unification of China, didn't just advise, he reshaped an entire civilization. His standardization of writing, currency, and law created the blueprint for imperial rule that lasted millennia. But his ambition came at a cost. When the emperor died, Lai Si conspired to hide the death, falsifying decrees to eliminate rivals until his own schemes unraveled. His fall was as dramatic as his rise, proving that viziers danced closest to the flame of power and often got burned. The Abbasid Caliphate's viziers, like the Barmakid family, show another facet of this influence. For generations, they controlled the empire's finances, military, and even cultural patronage, turning Baghdad into a beacon of learning. But their wealth and reach eventually sparked the caliph's paranoia. In a single night of betrayal, Harun al-Rashid ordered the Barmakids slaughtered, a stark reminder that no vizier's power was ever truly secure. What made these figures so indispensable and so dangerous was their mastery of systems. They didn't just navigate bureaucracy, they built it. A vizier could drain a kingdom's treasury to fund a war or redirect its wealth to buy loyalty. They spoke in the language of administration, but their real tool was psychology. They knew when to flatter a ruler's ego, when to stoke their fears, and when to quietly reinterpret their orders. In the end, the greatest viziers understood something kings often forgot. Power isn't just about who sits on the throne, it's about who controls the machinery that keeps it standing. And sometimes the hand that turns the gears holds the real authority. The most formidable warriors in history often wore chains before they wore crowns. Across civilizations, enslaved soldiers became the ultimate paradox men, trained to protect the very systems that denied them freedom, only to sometimes overthrow those systems entirely. The Roman Empire relied on Germanic bodyguards who could turn on their masters, while the Islamic world's Mamluks literally owned ones, forged a dynasty that ruled Egypt for centuries. These weren't just soldiers, they were carefully crafted instruments of power, honed from childhood to be utterly loyal, yet capable of reshaping empires when that loyalty fractured. Take the Janissaries, the Ottoman Empire's legendary slave corps, torn from Christian families as boys, converted to Islam, and drilled in martial perfection, they became the Sultan's personal army. Their discipline was unmatched, their privileges unparalleled. They dined from silver plates while common soldiers ate from clay. Yet this elite status bred audacity. By the 17th century, Janissaries weren't just defending the throne, they were kingmakers, deposing sultans who dared curb their power. Their barracks became a shadow court, where promotions were bought and policies dictated by the whisper of scimitars against silk sashes. The Mamluks took this contradiction even further. Purchased as children from Central Asia's steppes, they were schooled in warfare and governance, rising to command armies under the Ayyubid sultans. But in 1250, they didn't just serve their masters, they replaced them. When the last Ayyubid ruler threatened their autonomy, the Mamluks overthrew him, establishing a sultanate that repelled Mongol invasions and outlasted countless dynasties. Their secret, a self-perpetuating system where each generation of enslaved boys became the next era's rulers, blurring the line between servant and sovereign. Rome's slave generals reveal another twist in this tale. Men like Stilicho, the half-Vandal regent who defended the Western Empire from Goths and Huns, wielded power most nobles could only dream of. Yet his fate, executed on suspicion of treason, highlights the precariousness of such authority. Slave generals were both indispensable and expendable, trusted with empires precisely because they lacked hereditary claims, yet always one misstep from ruin. What made these warriors so dangerous wasn't just their skill, but their dual nature. Raised in isolation from society's hierarchies, they owed allegiance only to their training and their comrades. A Janissary's loyalty lay with his core, a Mamluk with his household, not with kings or constitutions. This made them unstoppable when commanded, but unpredictable when provoked. Their stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most effective guardians of power are those with nothing left to lose, until they decide they want everything. Behind every great ruler, there was often a woman who mastered the art of power without a crown, at least not at first. Royal consorts and concubines occupied a unique space in the courts of history, neither fully servant nor sovereign, yet capable of reshaping empires through whispered counsel and strategic alliances. Take Wu Zetian, who entered the Tang dynasty's court as a 14-year-old concubine, her status barely above a servant. Yet through a combination of intellect, ambition, and an uncanny ability to navigate the lethal politics of the harem, she climbed from the emperor's bedchamber to the throne itself, becoming China's only female emperor. Her reign wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a testament to how intimate access could be leveraged into absolute authority. She reformed the civil service, patronized Buddhism, and even commissioned secret police to root out dissent, proving that a concubine's influence could eclipse that of the nobles who once scorned her. The Byzantine Empire offers an equally striking example in Theodora, the actress-turned-empress whose rise defied every convention of her time. Born to a bear keeper and a dancer, she began her life in Constantinople's theaters, a world away from the marble halls of power. Yet her marriage to Emperor Justinian transformed her into a political force. When the Nika riots threatened to topple the empire, it was Theodora who refused to flee, declaring, "Purple makes a fine shroud," a reference to the imperial color. Her defiance stiffened Justinian's resolve, leading to a brutal crackdown that saved their rule. Behind the scenes, she championed women's rights, outlawing the trafficking of young girls and expanding divorce protections. Her legacy shows how a consort's influence could extend far beyond the bedroom, shaping laws and even the survival of the state itself. In the Ottoman Empire, the dynamics of power were even more intricate. Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, began as a slave concubine in Suleiman the Magnificent's harem. But she didn't just bear his children, she broke centuries of tradition by convincing the Sultan to marry her, a move unheard of for a ruler whose predecessors had always kept concubines at arm's length. From this unprecedented position, she orchestrated the downfall of rival factions, secured her son's succession, and even corresponded with foreign monarchs as a de facto diplomat. Her apartments in Topkapi Palace became a nerve center of politics, where alliances were forged and enemies quietly eliminated. What made these women so effective wasn't just their proximity to power, but their ability to operate within its blind spots. Nobles might dismiss a concubine as a mere plaything, underestimating her until it was too late. A queen like France's Catherine de' Medici, initially sidelined as a foreign bride, could exploit her role as regent to mastermind the Valois dynasty's survival during the Wars of Religion. She brokered marriages, manipulated factions, and even allegedly orchestrated assassinations, all while maintaining the facade of a dutiful widow. The paradox of these women's power lay in its fragility. They ruled through influence rather than edict, their authority contingent on the whims of husbands or sons. Yet that very vulnerability forced them to hone skills their male counterparts often lacked: keen emotional intelligence, mastery of patronage networks, and the ability to wield soft power long before the term existed. Their stories remind us that history's most enduring rulers weren't always the ones who sat on the throne. Sometimes they were the ones who taught the throne how to listen. The harem was never just a gilded cage, it was a chessboard where empires were won and lost. Behind its veiled corridors, women who history often dismisses as mere ornaments orchestrated coups, brokered treaties, and shaped dynasties with the precision of seasoned generals. In the Ottoman court, the title of Valide Sultan didn't just signify motherhood. It commanded a private army of eunuchs, controlled the imperial treasury, and even held veto power over military campaigns. When Suleiman the Magnificent's mother, Hafsa Sultan, intervened to halt a war with Venice, she didn't appeal to her son's emotions. She presented ledgers proving the campaign would bankrupt the navy. Her influence wasn't unique. A century later, Kursum Sultan ruled as regent for not one but two grandsons, outmaneuvering viziers and janissaries alike by cultivating a network of spies and merchants who reported directly to her chambers. China's imperial harems operated with similar sophistication. The Tang dynasty's Wu Zetian began her ascent as a concubine, but her real education came from observing the intricate alliances and betrayals between senior consorts. She learned that a whispered rumor could topple a chancellor, or that a well-timed gift to the emperor's favorite astrologer might sway celestial portents in her favor. By the time she seized power, she'd mastered a system where poetry competitions masked intelligence-gathering operations, and palace gardens hosted clandestine meetings with generals. Even in cultures where harems were less formalized, like Renaissance Europe, the same principles applied. Catherine de' Medici transformed the French court salons into political war rooms, using her daughter's marriages to weave a web of alliances across continents. Her infamous flying squadron of beautiful spies, ladies-in-waiting trained to extract secrets from infatuated nobles, proved that the personal was always political. What made these women so formidable wasn't just their access to rulers, but their understanding of soft power's machinery. A Valide sultan might fund a mosque to win public favor, while a Ming dynasty concubine could sabotage rivals by misplacing their letters to the emperor. They traded in favors, not decrees, building loyalty through patronage rather than force. Yet their power was double-edged. When the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed III ascended the throne, his first act was to execute 19 brothers and their mothers to prevent future plots. The harem's golden cages had trapdoors, and only the most cunning survived. These hidden governments remind us that real influence often thrives in spaces outsiders misunderstand. While kings waged wars on battlefields, the women of the harem fought quieter, deadlier wars, where a silk slipper could leave deeper marks than a sword. Power thrives in shadows, and no one understood this better than the spies who lurked in the corridors of ancient empires. The Roman Empire's frumentarii began as humble grain collectors, but by the 2nd century, they'd transformed into the emperor's most feared enforcers. Disguised as merchants or travelers, they carried secret orders in hollowed-out staffs, listening for whispers of rebellion in taverns and bathhouses. When a senator grew too popular or a general too ambitious, the frumentarii could arrange a quiet disappearance, no trial, no record. Their very anonymity made them indispensable. Emperor Domitian used them to purge rivals, but their unchecked power backfired when they became so hated that future rulers disbanded them only to replace them with even more secretive agents, the agents in rebus. China's Ming Dynasty took this dark art to another level with the Jinyue, the brocade-clad secret police who answered only to the emperor. Clad in embroidered uniforms to signify their direct mandate from heaven, they could arrest officials mid-ceremony, torture suspects with bamboo splinters under fingernails, or execute entire families for treason based on fabricated evidence. Their most potent weapon wasn't violence, but fear, the knowledge that any conversation might reach imperial ears. Even the highest minister could wake to find his household staff replaced by Jinyue informants. Yet their brutality sowed their downfall. When the Jinyue overreached, torturing scholars who criticized the emperor, public outrage forced even the throne to rein them in temporarily. The Byzantines refined spycraft into a science. Their secret service, the Crypteia, blended intelligence gathering with psychological warfare. Agents spread disinformation to destabilize enemy nations, bribed barbarian chiefs to betray their own kin, and even staged miracles to manipulate superstitious foes. Emperor Justinian's spymaster, Narsus, used networks of prostitutes and merchants to uncover a plot to burn Constantinople, then had the conspirators executed in the Hippodrome as a warning. But the Crypteia's greatest strength was also its weakness. Its leaders often knew too much. When a spymaster like John the Orphanotrophos amassed enough dirt to blackmail the emperor himself, he usually didn't survive the year. What made these networks so effective and so dangerous was their ambiguity. A Jinyue agent might be the man selling you tea yesterday. A frumentarius could be the scribe copying your letters today. They existed in the space between rumor and fact, where accusation could become truth with a nod from the throne, but their power was a double-edged sword. A spy who knew too many secrets became a liability. A secret police force that grew too bold could turn its machinery against the very ruler who created it. In the end, these invisible strings of power always carried the same lesson: trust no one, especially those who work in shadows. In the steamy jungles of the Maya world, where kings claimed to commune with gods, the true keepers of cosmic order weren't the rulers in their jaguar pelts, but the priests who held the sacred calendar. These men in feathered headdresses didn't just perform rituals. They decided when to plant, when to wage war, even when a king's reign would end. The Dresden Codex, their intricate bark paper almanac, wasn't merely a religious text, it was a political weapon. By declaring that the gods demanded more bloodletting ceremonies, priests could drain a kingdom's resources. By discovering unfavorable astrological alignments, they could force a ruler to delay campaigns or abdicate entirely. When drought struck Tikal in the 9th century, it wasn't the king who fell first, it was his high priest, sacrificed by rivals who blamed his failed divinations for the famine. Suma's temple complexes reveal an even tighter fusion of faith and power. The Ensi, a title-blending priest and governor, controlled Mesopotamia's earliest cities not through armies but through granaries. In a land where floods and droughts meant life or death, whoever held the temple storehouses held the people's survival in their hands. The Epic of Gilgamesh hints at this dynamic when the goddess Ishtar threatens to unleash the dead to outnumber the living. It's a metaphor for priestly power over food distribution. Cut-off rations and skeletons would indeed fill the streets. Little wonder that when Sargon of Akkad conquered Sumer, his first act wasn't to execute enemy kings, it was to install his daughter as high priestess of Ur, controlling both the spiritual narrative and the economic lifeline. Egypt's Amun priesthood took this gambit to staggering heights. By the New Kingdom, the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak owned more land than Pharaoh himself, its granaries feeding an army of scribes, artisans, and mercenaries. When Akhenaten tried to break their grip by replacing Amun with the sun disk Aten, the priests didn't revolt openly, they waited. After his death, they systematically erased his name from monuments, restored Amun's cult, and ensured no ruler would challenge them again. Their victory proved that gods might be immortal, but priestly power relied on cold, hard logistics. The Aztecs perfected this balance of terror. The Tlatoni emperor might wear the turquoise crown, but the high priest of Huitzilopochtli decided which captives would keep the sun moving across the sky. During the disastrous reign of Moctezuma II, his priests insisted on ever larger sacrifices to avert doom, until the people began whispering that the gods themselves had abandoned their ruler. When Cortés arrived, these simmering tensions exploded. Many Aztec nobles saw the Spanish not as invaders, but as tools of the priests' failed prophecies, accelerating the empire's collapse. What united these sacred power brokers was their monopoly on the unknowable. Kings could command armies, but only priests could read the stars, interpret sacrifices, or promise rain. Their authority came from standing between humanity and chaos until the day their predictions failed, their granaries emptied, or a clever rival learned to speak in the god's voice. Then, as the Maya discovered, the same hands that anointed kings could just as easily prepare their burial shrouds. When we gaze at the pyramids of Giza or walk the halls of Versailles, we see the grandeur of kings, but we're missing the hands that turned those visions into stone. Master builders were more than skilled laborers. They were the original spin doctors, crafting physical propaganda that shouted a ruler's might in a language every subject could understand. Imhotep's step pyramid at Saqqara wasn't just an engineering marvel. It was a revolution in political theater. Before him, pharaohs were buried in simple mud-brick mastabas. By stacking 6 increasingly smaller layers toward the heavens, Imhotep didn't just build a tomb, he visually reinforced the hierarchy of Egyptian society, with the god-king literally towering above all. The pyramid's flawless geometry whispered of divine precision, while its sheer scale declared that only a ruler with absolute control could command such a feat. But builders held more than symbolic power. They knew the secrets in the walls. In medieval Constantinople, the architects of the Theodosian walls embedded weaknesses known only to a select few. When enemies breached one section during sieges, defenders could funnel them into kill zones designed to collapse under precise conditions. The men who drew those plans effectively held the city's survival in their compasses. Similarly, Renaissance architects like Michelangelo hid escape routes in the Vatican's walls, allowing popes to vanish during invasions or coups. These weren't just functional details, they were insurance policies. A builder who knew where the secret tunnels lay could bargain for his life or sell that knowledge to the highest bidder. The Mughal Empire took this further, turning architecture into psychological warfare. Shah Jahan's chief architect, Ustad Ahmad Lahori, designed the Taj Mahal not just as a mausoleum, but as a carefully calibrated display of imperial grief. The perfect symmetry, the way light filters through jolly screens to illuminate the cenotaphs at dawn, these weren't aesthetic choices alone. They forced visitors to walk past reflecting pools that doubled the structure's apparent size before entering a chamber where echoes made even whispers sound like divine pronouncements. Every element manipulated perception, reinforcing the emperor's connection to the eternal. Perhaps no builders wielded more subtle influence than those of the Forbidden City. Its designers used color psychology, yellow roof tiles reserved for the emperor, red walls symbolizing prosperity, to condition behavior before a subject even reached the throne room. The 9x9 spike pattern on palace doors, 9 being the imperial number, subtly reminded visitors of the hierarchy they were entering, but the real power lay in the hidden details. The slight elevation of the emperor's path through courtyards ensured he always appeared to walk above others, while concealed drainage systems could flood certain passages during emergencies, creating instant barriers against revolt. The darker truth, many of these architects paid for their knowledge with their lives. After completing Topkapi Palace, Sultan Mehmed II allegedly had its lead architect executed to protect the building's secrets. In ancient Persia, engineers who designed underground irrigation systems were sometimes blinded to prevent them from revealing water sources to enemies. These extremes reveal a chilling paradox: the very expertise that made builders indispensable also made them threats. Their blueprints weren't just instructions for construction, they were maps to the vulnerabilities of power itself. What does this tell us? That stone and mortar were never just materials, they were the weapons of a silent war. A well-placed column could awe subjects into submission, a hidden corridor could save a dynasty, and a strategically weak wall could doom an empire. The next time you stand before an ancient monument, look past the grandeur. The real story isn't in the stones, it's in the hands that placed them, and the minds that understood how shapes could shape history. Tax collectors were the lifeblood of empires and their most vulnerable pressure point. In ancient Rome, the publicani weren't just bureaucrats with ledgers, they were private contractors who bid for the right to squeeze provinces dry. A winning bidder might promise the treasury 1 million denarii from Judea's olive harvest, then extract 2 million to pocket the difference. The system incentivized brutality. If a Galilean farmer couldn't pay, the publicani could seize his land, sell his children into slavery, or even crucify him as a warning to others. Yet without this ruthless efficiency, Rome's legions would have starved. When Julius Caesar invaded Gaul, it was the publicani who funded his campaigns by bleeding Spain and North Africa white, until even their greed backfired. In 60 B.C., their extortion sparked such revolts in Asia Minor that Pompey had to temporarily strip their powers, proving that even empires built on theft had limits. Persia's satraps took a subtler approach. Appointed as regional governors, they were expected to deliver fixed sums to the royal treasury. Anything extra was their personal profit. The system worked beautifully until it didn't. A satrap like Orots in Sardis could amass enough wealth to raise private armies, assassinate rivals, and even defy the great king himself. Darius I eventually had Orots poisoned for rebellion, but the lesson was clear. The men who controlled gold flows could choke the throne itself. The Achaemenids tried checks and balances. Royal inspectors called the king's eyes monitored satraps, yet corruption persisted. When Alexander invaded, many Persian governors willingly surrendered, knowing their financial networks would survive regime change. China's mandarins faced a different dilemma. The Qin dynasty's legalist policies demanded exacting quotas, with magistrates punished for shortfalls. This bred creative accounting. A county might report phantom villages to lower expectations or inflate disaster reports to excuse missing grain. By the Han era, the salt and iron monopolies became the ultimate cash cows. Officials like Sang Hung Yong didn't just tax these goods, they controlled production, creating shortages to spike prices. When scholars protested the suffering this caused, Emperor Wu silenced them, proving that revenue trumped ethics. Yet even he couldn't ignore the backlash forever. After his death, the monopolies were briefly abolished until the next war required funding. The Byzantine Empire's taxmen wielded a unique weapon: bureaucracy. The Commercioi didn't just collect taxes, they manipulated the entire economy. By controlling silk production state-run from worm to loom, they could flood markets to bankrupt Armenian merchants or withhold shipments to pressure foreign kings. Their ledgers were labyrinths of hidden fees. A ship docking at Constantinople paid harbor dues, lighthouse taxes, even a wave compensation fee for wear on the docks. Emperor Justinian's fiscal director, John the Cappadocian, became so hated that rioters nearly burned him alive, yet his innovations funded the reconquest of Italy. What made tax collectors so dangerous was their dual role as both sustainers and saboteurs of power. A Roman procurator could fund legions to crush rebellions, or secretly bankroll those rebellions if he bet on the wrong contender. Persia's satraps kept the empire running but could also dismantle it piecemeal. These weren't just accountants, they were gamblers playing the longest game of all, knowing that empires rise and fall, but gold always finds its way into someone's pockets. Their legacy is a reminder: behind every throne's glory lies a ledger stained with ink and sometimes blood. A single bite could rewrite history, and food tasters knew this better than anyone. These unsung guardians stood where power and paranoia intersected, their palates trained to detect the faintest hint of arsenic or hemlock in a ruler's meal. But their job wasn't just about surviving dinner, it was about mastering the art of discretion. In the Byzantine court, a taster might sample a dozen dishes before the emperor lifted his fork, all while absorbing whispers of treason, marriage alliances, or military strategies. They were the ultimate confidants, privy to conversations no advisor would ever hear. When Emperor Justinian's taster, a eunuch named Narsus, noticed a tremor in the hand of a servant delivering wine, he didn't just avert an assassination. He unraveled an entire conspiracy linking rival generals to the Persian court. The risks were as calculated as the rewards. A taster's loyalty could be bought, and their silence came at a premium. In Renaissance Italy, the Sforza family employed blind tasters, believing men who couldn't see the faces of conspirators would be harder to bribe. Yet even this precaution failed when a Medici spy slipped gold coins into a taster's palm alongside his daily bread. Sometimes the poison wasn't in the food at all, it was in the leverage. A Mughal emperor's taster in India, after years of surviving spiced dishes laced with toxins, was finally undone not by poison but by blackmail. His handlers threatened his family unless he deliberately missed detecting a harmless but bitter herb, allowing the emperor to publicly survive an assassination attempt and justify purging his court. The most successful tasters turned their vulnerability into power. At Versailles, Louis XIV's chief gauteur, a man named Claude, parlayed his position into a minor title by strategically overhearing plots and reporting them, but only after letting them develop enough to implicate high-ranking nobles. His successors went further, maintaining secret ledgers of which courtiers requested unusual spices or imported delicacies, requests that often signaled impending betrayals. But the role's fragility was its defining feature. For every taster who gained influence, there were dozens who died anonymously. Russian Tsars rotated their tasters weekly to prevent familiarity from breeding conspiracy, while Ottoman sultans kept their food testers in chains between meals, both a precaution and a grim reminder of their expendability. The bitter truth: these human antidotes were both shield and sacrifice. their lives a currency exchanged for royal survival. Their stories remind us that the surest way to a ruler's trust wasn't through flattery or valor, but through the willingness to take the first lethal bite. The relationship between a royal tutor and their student was never just about lessons. It was a slow, deliberate shaping of the world's future. Consider Aristotle pacing the courtyards of Mieza, where he taught a teenage Alexander not just philosophy, but how to see himself as a living bridge between Greek civilization and the barbarian East. Those lectures on ethics and politics weren't abstract exercises, they were blueprints for empire. When Alexander later fused Persian customs with Macedonian rule, or sought out the wisdom of Egyptian priests and Indian sages, he was executing Aristotle's vision of a unified cosmos under enlightened leadership. Yet that same education bred contradictions. Aristotle's belief in natural slavery justified Alexander's brutal conquests, while his mentor's insistence on Greek superiority clashed with the young king's later efforts to blend cultures. The tutor's fingerprints were all over history's canvas, even when his pupils' actions smudged the lines. Not all mentors were so fortunate in their gaze. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher tasked with tempering Nero's impulses, discovered too late that wisdom can't always curb cruelty. For years, he penned speeches urging mercy and moderation, words Nero delivered convincingly while secretly poisoning rivals. Seneca's own writings on ethics became grotesquely ironic as his student descended into tyranny, ordering the deaths of his mother and stepbrother. The philosopher's eventual forced suicide by Nero's command was a grim lesson. Tutoring a future ruler is like holding a serpent. You might guide its path for a time, but you'll never control its venom. Sometimes a tutor's influence backfired spectacularly. Plato's disastrous stint in Syracuse reads like a cautionary tale. Convinced he could mold the tyrant Dionysius II into a philosopher king, Plato arrived with dreams of an ideal republic. Instead, he found a ruler more interested in using philosophy to appear sophisticated than to govern justly. When Plato criticized Dionysius' extravagance, he was sold into slavery, barely rescued by friends. Yet even this failure rippled through history. Plato's disillusionment with practical politics led him to refine his theories, influencing centuries of political thought. The tutor's defeat became philosophy's gain. In contrast, the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mamun's patronage of the House of Wisdom showed tutoring's transformative potential. By surrounding himself with scholars translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts, he didn't just educate himself, he catalyzed the Islamic Golden Age. His personal tutor, the polymath Al-Kindi, didn't merely instruct, he helped build an intellectual ecosystem where mathematics, medicine, and astronomy flourished. Here, the tutor-student dynamic expanded beyond two people to shape an entire civilization's trajectory. The stakes were just as high in medieval Europe, where Thomas Aquinas' teachings on just war and moral law became foundational for kings like Louis IX of France. Aquinas' blend of faith and reason offered rulers a framework to legitimize or restrain their power. When Louis used these principles to refuse his nobles' demand for aggressive wars, proving that a well-tutored mind could resist bloodlust, it demonstrated education's quiet power to avert catastrophe. These relationships reveal a paradox. The most effective royal tutors were those who understood their limits. They planted ideas like time-delayed seeds, knowing they might not live to see them bloom or wither. Their legacy wasn't just in the rulers they created, but in the alternatives they offered. Every scroll unrolled, every dialogue crafted was a silent challenge. Will you use power to serve or to dominate? The answer determined not just a reign's success, but its place in history's judgment. In an age before satellites and encryption, the fastest route to power wasn't through armies or gold. it was through the legs of a trusted messenger. The Persian angaros weren't just couriers, they were the original information superhighway, a network of riders who could outpace storms and outmaneuver rebellions. With the authority to seize fresh horses at any post station, they could cover 200 miles in a single day, a speed unmatched until the steam engine. But their real power lay in what they carried, words that could launch wars or halt them, legitimize kings or condemn them. When Cyrus the Great needed to solidify his conquest of Babylon, it wasn't his generals who ensured victory, it was the angaros who delivered his decree promising religious freedom to the city's inhabitants, turning resistance into reluctant acceptance with a single scroll. Yet this system had a fatal flaw. Every messenger was a potential rogue actor. In ancient China, the Qin dynasty's strict laws punished delayed dispatches with mutilation, but even this couldn't prevent sabotage. A single corrupted courier carrying troop movements to the frontier could reroute them into ambush by misreading terrain markings. The Roman cursus publicus faced similar vulnerabilities. When Emperor Tiberius's heir Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances, rumors swirled that his orders for medical aid had been delayed by messengers loyal to rival factions. The truth vanished with the road dust, but the lesson didn't. Whoever controlled the flow of information controlled reality itself. The Byzantines institutionalized this dark art. Their dromos messengers didn't just deliver letters, they edited them. A skilled rider could soften a rebuke from the emperor to a rebellious general by mishearing the dictated words, or lose a damning sentence when transcribing at a relay station. Some carried twin scrolls, one for show, one for the recipient's eyes only. The system reached its zenith with Basil II, who used coded messages hidden in plain sight. A seemingly routine grain shipment order might contain troop numbers written in vinegar ink, visible only when heated. The couriers themselves often couldn't read the secrets they carried, making them perfect unwitting accomplices. Medieval Europe's monastic messengers added another layer: divine intimidation. A papal missive sealed with the fisherman's ring wasn't just a letter, it was a psychological weapon. Few nobles dared intercept a parchment bearing the threat of excommunication, even as abbots quietly skimmed their contents for political intelligence. When King John of England faced rebellion, his survival hinged on Cistercian monks who smuggled pleas for help to the Vatican through bandit-infested forests, their robes offering both camouflage and sanctity. The most brilliant twist: some messengers became powers in their own right. The Inca chasquis didn't just run, they memorized. Trained from childhood in quipu, not writing and oral repetition, they could recite tax records, battle reports, or poetry verbatim across mountain ranges. Unlike paper, a human mind couldn't be intercepted without leaving traces. When the Spanish arrived, these living databases became the empire's last line of defense, until conquistadors realized silencing them was as crucial as burning temples. What united these systems was their creators' grim understanding. Information is only as reliable as its weakest carrier. A Mongol arrow could kill a messenger, but a bribed one could kill a kingdom. The Angaro's speed, the Dromo's duplicity, the Chasquis' minds, all were tools to solve the oldest problem of power: how to control the narrative when it's always one horse ride away from chaos. In the shadowy corners of imperial palaces, where feasts doubled as battlefields, the humblest servants wielded the deadliest power. A Roman emperor's last meal might begin with harmless-looking mushrooms, plump, fragrant, and expertly laced with toxins by the very hands that tended the palace gardens. Claudius's death in 54 AD remains one of history's most infamous culinary conspiracies, with his wife Agrippina allegedly orchestrating the poisoning through a dish of his favorite fungi. But the real genius lay in the execution. A skilled gardener didn't just know which plants could kill, they understood timing, dosage, and the art of plausible denial. Hemlock might leave a corpse contorted in unmistakable agony, while a carefully measured dose of belladonna could mimic natural illness, buying conspirators precious days to secure their coup. The imperial gardens of ancient Rome were more than just ornamental. They were laboratories of subterfuge. A trusted horticulturist could cultivate aconite between the rosemary, its purple flowers dismissed as decorative while its roots yielded a toxin nicknamed the Queen of Poisons for its untraceable, rapid effects. The Persian Empire took this further, employing royal herb masters who disguised lethal doses of strychnine in fragrant jasmine teas, exploiting the victim's trust in beauty's innocence. Even the Vatican wasn't immune. Renaissance popes employed botanical experts to grow antidotes alongside poisons, creating a deadly game of horticultural chess where every bouquet might hold salvation or doom. What made these green-thumbed assassins so effective was their invisibility. A soldier's sword raised alarms, but a gardener's trowel drew no suspicion. In Byzantium, the eunuch Narsus reportedly ended a rival's rise by gifting him a bouquet of oleander, its sweetness masking a cardiac toxin. Japan's ninja clans elevated this to an art, training operatives to infiltrate castles as humble groundskeepers, their knowledge of nightshade and foxglove deadlier than any blade. The Mughal Empire's royal gardens featured serene lotus ponds and discreet patches of water hemlock, ready to be harvested should a nobleman overstep. Yet the greatest poisoners were those who mastered psychology as deftly as botany. A Tudor herbalist might spike a noble's wine with just enough arsenic to induce sickness, then save him with a prepared antidote, earning undying loyalty. Louis XIV's gardeners at Versailles grew harmless chamomile beside identical-looking poison hemlock, ensuring any would-be assassins risked killing themselves during harvest. These weren't mere murderers, they were psychological tacticians who understood that fear could paralyze long before poison took effect, the darkest truth. Many of these silent killers never faced justice. Without modern toxicology, death often wore the mask of natural causes. When Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI succumbed after eating mushrooms in 1740, court physicians blamed apoplexy. By then, the gardener who'd harvested them had vanished into the countryside, leaving history to wonder. Was it misfortune or the last whisper of an empire's most patient assassins? Their legacy lingers in our language. Salad comes from the Latin herba salata, or salted greens, a reminder that every bite could be a gamble when power sat at the table. When the stars spoke, kings listened and astrologers held the keys to their heavenly whispers. In the candlelit observatories of Babylon, where the night sky was a celestial ledger of divine will, these stargazers didn't just predict eclipses, they orchestrated them. A single ominous alignment could send a ruler scrambling to delay his coronation, or better yet, cancel arrivals. Take the case of King Nabonidus, the last ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, whose reign crumbled not just from Persian swords but from the whispers of his own astrologers. When they discovered that the moon god Sin demanded his absence from Babylon for years, the king retreated to Arabia, leaving his capital vulnerable. Was it divine mandate or a calculated move by priests who favored his enemies? The stars never tell, but power always leaves clues. China's imperial astrologers wielded even subtler knives. The Ming Dynasty's Qin-Tian-Jian, or Bureau of Astronomy, didn't just chart comets, they weaponized them. A disruptive planetary conjunction could derail a general's campaign, while a conveniently timed auspicious day might fast-track a favored prince's succession. When the Yongle emperor needed to justify his bloody usurpation, his astrologers resurrected an ancient prophecy about a purple star, heralding a rightful ruler, coincidentally matching the emperor's birth chart. The lesson: celestial omens were less about astronomy and more about narrative control. The real genius lay in plausible deniability. A Babylonian astrologer could point to Venus lingering too long in Scorpio as proof of divine displeasure, knowing no one could refute the god's handwriting. In Rome, when Tiberius's astrologer Thrasyllus predicted the emperor's rise, he did so while standing on a cliff, with guards ready to hurl him into the sea if his forecast failed. Survival sharpened one's prophetic accuracy, but the most audacious manipulations happened in the shadows. Islamic court astrologers during the Abbasid Caliphate perfected the art of retroactive prophecy. After a caliph's victory, they'd rediscover ancient star charts, predicting his triumph all along, cementing his legitimacy. Conversely, a failed rebellion could be blamed on misread horoscopes, with the astrologer conveniently executed for incompetence rather than conspiracy. These star readers understood something modern leaders forget: power thrives on mystery. When Tang Dynasty Empress Wu Zetian commissioned a new constellation aligning with her reign, she wasn't just celebrating, she was rewriting the cosmos to match her ambition. The stars, after all, never argue, they just shine silently on those who know how to interpret their light. Gold has always been the silent partner to every throne, but those who controlled its flow held power even kings dared not challenge. In the smoke-filled counting houses of medieval Europe, where loans were negotiated in whispers and contracts written in code, bankers weren't just financiers, they were puppet masters pulling the strings of empires. The Knights Templar, that pious order of warrior monks, built a financial network so vast it became the de facto treasury of Europe's monarchs. Their vaults under Paris didn't just store treasure, they held the fate of nations. When Louis VII needed funds for the Second Crusade, it was the Templars who advanced the gold with interest rates that would make kings bleed for generations. But the real game wasn't in lending, it was in leverage. Jewish moneylenders, forced into finance by exclusion from other trades, perfected this dark art. In England, Aaron of Lincoln's ledgers showed loans to half the nobility before his death in 1186. His wealth exceeded the crown's, making him untouchable until Henry II confiscated his assets posthumously. Spain's converso bankers played even deeper games. Families like the Santangels funded Columbus' voyage while secretly negotiating with Ferdinand and Isabella to protect Jewish communities from the Inquisition for a price. These weren't just transactions, they were high-stakes diplomacy where promissory notes carried more weight than swords. Philip IV of France exposed the system's brutal truth when he turned on his Templar bankers in 1307. The charges of heresy were theatrical props. The real crime was his astronomical debt. By burning Grand Master Jacques de Molay at the stake, Philip didn't just erase his IOUs, he sent a chilling message to all financiers: serve the crown but never surpass it. Yet even this Pyrrhic victory backfired. With the Templars gone, Philip had to rely on Italian bankers like the Frescobaldi, who charged even steeper rates. The Medici would later exploit this vacuum, turning Florence into Europe's new financial heart through creative accounting, like inventing double-entry bookkeeping not just for clarity, but to hide loans to warring popes. The darkest irony, these financial networks often funded both sides of conflicts. The same Jewish bankers who bankrolled Richard the Lionheart's crusade also lent to his enemy Saladin. Augsburg's Fugger family kept meticulous neutrality, financing Habsburg wars against France while secretly extending credit to French nobles. This wasn't betrayal, it was business. A banker's loyalty wasn't to crowns but to compound interest. When Charles V needed gold to bribe electors for the Holy Roman Emperor title, Jakob Fugger famously reminded him, "Without my help, your majesty would not have attained the imperial crown." The unspoken threat hung heavier than any imperial decree. What made these money men so formidable was their mastery of intangible power. A king could seize a banker's assets, but not his knowledge of hidden accounts or foreign exchange tricks. The Templars' real treasure wasn't their gold, it was their encrypted ledgers showing which nobles had mortgaged their titles. The Lombard bankers' strength lay in their network of couriers who could move funds across borders faster than armies. And when all else failed, there was always the ultimate weapon, credit withdrawal. Nothing brought a warlord to his knees faster than his soldiers going unpaid. The lesson written in these centuries-old balance sheets is uncomfortably modern. True power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a money pouch and knows exactly when to tighten the strings. History remembers rebellions as grand uprisings led by warrior kings or charismatic revolutionaries. But some of the most devastating revolts began with a whisper in the servants' quarters. The Abbasid revolution of the 8th century didn't start on a battlefield. It simmered in the ink-stained hands of Persian scribes who'd grown tired of playing second fiddle to their Arab overlords. For decades, these bureaucrats had kept the Umayyad Caliphate running, collecting taxes, drafting decrees, and maintaining the complex machinery of empire, all while being treated as second-class citizens. Their resentment was a slow, burning fuse, and when the Abbasid family promised equality, the scribes didn't just join the cause, they became its architects. Secret letters were forged, supply routes sabotaged, and critical intelligence misplaced until the Umayyads found their empire collapsing from within, betrayed by the very hands that had held it together. Half a world away in Tang Dynasty China, the An Lushan rebellion erupted from a similar well of overlooked ambition. An Lushan wasn't some backwater warlord, he was the emperor's own adopted son, a favored general who'd risen through the ranks by playing the perfect loyal servant. He entertained the court with his clownish dances, flattered the emperor's favorite concubine, and mastered the art of appearing harmless. But behind the laughter was a razor-sharp mind that recognized the empire's fragility. When he finally turned his armies against the throne in 755, the rebellion wasn't just a military campaign, it was a psychological masterstroke. An Lushan knew which provincial governors had been slighted, which eunuchs secretly resented the emperor, and which supply officers could be bribed to look the other way. By the time the dust settled, millions were dead and the Tang dynasty never fully recovered. The lesson: servants see everything. A butler knows which doors creak, a scribe knows which records can be altered, and a general knows where the supply lines are weakest. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian faced the Nika riots, it wasn't the mob he feared. It was his own palace guards, whose loyalty had been eroded by withheld pay and whispered grievances. His salvation came from an unlikely source, the eunuch Narsus, who slipped into the barracks with bags of gold and promises of promotion, turning potential traitors back into defenders. Even failed rebellions reveal the power of the overlooked. When Roman Emperor Elagabalus alienated the Praetorian Guard by replacing seasoned officers with his favorite charioteers and dancers, he didn't just insult their pride, he shattered the unspoken contract between ruler and protector. The guards didn't just kill him, they dragged his mutilated body through the streets and tossed it in the Tiber, a gruesome reminder of what happens when servants feel betrayed. These stories force us to rethink power's anatomy. Thrones aren't toppled by swords alone, they're eroded by the quiet defiance of those who polish the silver, tally the taxes, and sharpen the blades. The next time you read about a fallen dynasty, look past the battlefield maps and ask who sharpened the swords, who counted the coins, and when the moment came, who looked the other way. In the gilded halls of Versailles, where nobles strutted like peacocks in silk and lace, the real power wasn't in the jewels they wore, it was in the whispers they couldn't hear. Servants didn't just pour wine and adjust wigs. They were the invisible conductors of courtly symphonies, their gossip the baton that could raise a favorite to glory or plunge them into disgrace. Consider the fate of Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's most dazzling mistress. Her downfall began not with a rival's plot, but with a chambermaid's offhand remark about black masses and poisoned prayers, overheard by a laundress who sold the story to a Jesuit confessor. Within weeks, the king's bedchamber became a crime scene, and the woman who'd once held France in her palm was exiled to a convent. This wasn't accidental, it was arithmetic. Every servant in the palace knew the value of a secret. A valet might trade news of a duke's gambling debts to a rival family's cook for information about an impending marriage alliance. A lady's maid could barter her mistress's lover's identity for a promotion to a more lucrative household. The scullery boys who cleaned ashes from fireplaces were the era's data miners, piecing together correspondence fragments left unburned. Even the king's barber held leverage, his razor at the royal throat each morning, his ears catching every murmured insecurity or unguarded confession. The genius of these whisper networks lay in their deniability. A noble might dismiss a footman as furniture, never suspecting that his thoughtless gossip about a missed tax payment had been carefully seeded by a rival steward. When the Duc de Bourgogne's political ambitions collapsed overnight, few traced it back to the harmless chatter of his wife's hairdresser, who'd been bribed to mention his ties to banned Jansenist texts at the Queen's card game. By the time the damage was done, the trail had dissolved into the palace's echo chamber. Some servants turned this trade into an art form. The Marquise de Pompadour, before rising to become Louis XV's chief mistress, honed her skills as a salon hostess by cultivating spies in every great household. Her most valuable asset, a network of lowly under-butlers who recorded which guests slipped away together at parties, information she later used to manipulate alliances. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the Habsburgs employed Hofkriegsrat agents disguised as servants to spread disinformation during wartime, ensuring enemy ambassadors received confidential reports from seemingly drunk grooms or chatty scullions. But the darkest whispers weren't always about scandal, they were about survival. When smallpox swept through Versailles in 1723, the staff knew which nobles were infected days before the court physicians admitted it. Chambermaids burned contaminated sheets and lied about fevers to protect their favorites, while others sold early warnings to panicked courtiers desperate to flee. In those moments, the social order flipped. The mightiest aristocrat begged a housemaid for news, and a stable boy's rumor could empty an entire wing of the palace. What made these networks unstoppable was their fractal nature. Crush one whisper chain and three more sprouted in its place. Fire a talkative footman, and his replacement would be just as hungry for secrets and twice as bitter. Even the Sun King learned this the hard way. After expelling dozens of servants for gossiping, he found his own isolation unbearable. Without the underground news flow, he couldn't sense shifting loyalties or brewing revolts. Within months, he quietly rehired the very spies he'd banished, proving that in the economy of influence, even absolute monarchs needed the currency of whispers. These shadowy exchanges reveal a truth that transcends time. Power isn't just about who holds the scepter, but who controls the narrative. A throne might be built on laws and armies, but its stability rests on something far more fragile: the human hunger to know and to be known. And in that hunger, the humblest hands could pull the mightiest strings. Forgery wasn't just a crime in the ancient world, it was an art form, practiced with such skill that some fakes reshaped empires. Take the donation of Constantine, a document that supposedly proved the 4th century emperor gifted Rome to the Pope. For centuries, this parchment justified the Catholic Church's vast temporal power, until Renaissance scholars noticed its Latin was suspiciously modern. The forgery was so convincing it had fooled kings and scholars for 800 years, but the real genius wasn't in the penmanship, it was in the timing. Created during the Middle Ages when the papacy needed leverage against Germanic invaders, the document didn't just imitate antiquity, it weaponized it, turning nostalgia into political capital. China's imperial courts faced a different kind of paper warfare. When the Han Dynasty's founder, Liu Bang, needed to legitimize his peasant origins, his scribes discovered ancient prophecies linking his birth to dragon sightings and celestial omens. These weren't clumsy lies, they were masterclasses in psychological manipulation. By embedding his legitimacy in fabricated cosmic events, Liu made rebellion seem like defiance of heaven itself. Centuries later, Tang Dynasty officials refined the craft, using specialized ink that aged artificially to prove land grants dated back generations. A single forged deed could dispossess entire villages, their protests drowned out by the authority of yellowed parchment. The most audacious forgeries targeted not just property but faith itself. Medieval Europe's relic trade turned saints' bones into a booming black market. Enterprising monks found enough splinters of the true cross to build a cathedral, while competing churches claimed ownership of the same martyr's skull. In Constantinople, a clever cleric boosted pilgrim revenue by discovering the Virgin Mary's robe, conveniently hidden for centuries beneath his own altar. These weren't mere scams, they were geopolitical tools. When Baldwin II, the cash-strapped Latin emperor of Constantinople, sold Christ's crown of thorns to Louis IX of France, the transaction came with a team of Venetian bankers to authenticate it. The relic's arrival in Paris didn't just fill Baldwin's coffers, it transferred spiritual prestige from the fading Byzantine Empire to rising France. Yet the greatest forgers understood that the best lies contain kernels of truth. The Maya codices burned by Spanish priests likely included authentic histories alongside adjustments praising current rulers. Roman officials facing census quotas would pad rolls with imaginary citizens, then collect taxes from real people under those names. Even Shakespeare's infamous Lost Years might trace to a clever secretary's decision to erase his patron's youthful indiscretions from court records. These weren't random acts of deceit, they were calculated edits to reality's ledger. What separated history's most successful forgers from bumbling counterfeiters was their grasp of human nature. A clumsy fake might copy a seal or mimic handwriting, but a masterful one replicated trust. When Ottoman scribes forged letters from rival princes to sow discord, they included subtle flaws, just enough for recipients to catch and feel clever, cementing their belief in the rest. Byzantine spies slipping fake battle reports into enemy camps knew panic spread fastest when seasoned officers thought they'd uncovered the truth themselves. The legacy of these fabricators forces us to confront an uncomfortable irony. The documents we rely on to understand the past were often tools to manipulate the present. Behind every disputed treaty, every miraculous relic, every prophecy that just happened to come true, there might have been a servant with a steady hand, a sharp quill, and a sharper understanding of how easily power bends when paper whispers the right lies. A ruler's most trusted protectors often held the sharpest knives, a paradox as old as power itself. The Praetorian Guard, originally founded as Augustus' personal security detail, devolved into Rome's most notorious kingmakers. By the 3rd century, these elite soldiers realized they didn't need to conquer the empire, they could simply sell it. In 1933, after assassinating Emperor Pertinax, they auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. Senator Didius Julianus won the bidding war, promising each guardsman a staggering 25,000 sesterces, only to be executed 2 months later when the next general marched into Rome. The message was clear: loyalty had a price, and the Praetorians kept the receipt. Ottoman janissaries took this lethal duality further. Trained from childhood to serve the Sultan without question, they became so indispensable that their annual salary hikes and promotions evolved into sacred rituals. But by the 16th century, their loyalty had a vicious catch. Any sultan who reduced their privileges risked a muskets-down revolt. In 1622, Osman II learned this the hard way. When he dared suggest replacing them with a new corps, the janissaries stormed the palace, strangled him with a bowstring, and installed his pliable uncle instead. Their power became so entrenched that later sultans like Selim III were forced to stage elaborate charades publicly praising the janissaries while secretly building rival units in Anatolia. The Byzantine Varangian Guard offered a fascinating counterpoint. Composed of Norse and Anglo-Saxon mercenaries, their foreignness was their greatest asset. With no local ties or political ambitions, they became the emperor's most reliable enforcers. When Basil II blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, it was the Varangians who swung the hammers, a grim testament to their detachment. Yet even they weren't infallible. In 1071, their commander Rasul de Behlul rebelled, carving out his own mini-kingdom in Anatolia until the emperor hired Turkish mercenaries to crush him. China's Imperial Guard mastered a different game, the art of visible invisibility. During the Ming Dynasty, the embroidered uniform guard acted as the emperor's eyes, wearing distinctive golden armor to intimidate officials. But their real power lay in blending into the background. A guard stationed motionless for hours at a palace gate wasn't just security. He was a sponge absorbing every whispered conspiracy. When the Yongle Emperor suspected his chief minister of treason, it was these invisible guards who provided the damning evidence extracted during night raids. The French Revolution exposed the ultimate vulnerability of royal protectors. The Swiss Guards, famed for their loyalty, were massacred defending Louis XVI's Tuileries Palace in 1792. Their sacrifice proved tragically futile. The king had already fled to the Legislative Assembly, where revolutionaries arrested him. The Swiss died for a symbol that no longer existed, their blood staining the courtyard in a brutal lesson. Even the most devoted bodyguards can't protect a throne stripped of legitimacy. From Rome's Praetorians to the Shah of Iran's immortals, these elite units faced the same impossible calculus: too weak and they failed their duty, too strong and they became the threat. Their histories whisper a chilling warning. When the line between protector and predator depends solely on gold or grievance, every monarch is just one bad payday away from becoming a footnote. The echoes of ancient power brokers resonate in the marble corridors of modern capitals and the glass towers of corporate headquarters. Today's lobbyists whispering into legislators' ears are the spiritual heirs of Byzantine eunuchs who once filtered access to emperors. Both understand that influence thrives in the space between request and response. Consider how a pharmaceutical lobbyist, armed with carefully curated data and campaign contributions, can shape healthcare policy as decisively as a Ming Dynasty scribe altering tax records. The tools have changed from wax tablets to PowerPoint decks, but the strategy remains: control the narrative and you control the outcome. civil servants are the new viziers, wielding bureaucratic levers with quiet precision. A mid-level regulator drafting environmental standards may lack the title of Ottoman Grand Vizier, but their pen holds similar power to redirect industries. The European Union's unelected commissioners, for instance, craft regulations affecting 500 million people, much like the Han Dynasty's mandarins whose edicts flowed from bureaucratic offices rather than the emperor's throne. What both systems share is the understanding that durability lies in institutions, not individuals. When a U.S. presidential administration changes, the deep state career officials remain, just as Byzantine bureaucrats outlasted emperors. Corporate culture has its own shadow architects. The executive assistant who controls a CEO's calendar mirrors the Ottoman Kisler Agassi managing harem access. Silicon Valley's gatekeepers, VC associates and talent scouts decide which ideas reach funding, much like Renaissance papal secretaries determined which petitions reach the Pope's desk. Even modern HR departments function like imperial guard units, enforcing cultural orthodoxy under the guise of policy. Google's infamous Culture Committee in the early 2000s, which screened hires for googliness, operated with the same exclusivity as Ming Dynasty palace eunuchs vetting officials for loyalty. The most striking evolution lies in data custodians, today's answer to ancient scribes. Social media algorithms that amplify or suppress content are the genuine way of the digital age, policing discourse without visible intervention. A Facebook content moderator removing posts has more in common with a Tang Dynasty censor than we might care to admit. Both make judgment calls that shape public reality. Edward Snowden's revelations exposed how modern spy agencies like Persian and Garrow's couriers control information flows, except now they intercept trillions of bytes instead of scrolls. Yet the core vulnerability persists. Just as Roman tax farmers provoked revolts through greed, modern corporate lobbyists invite backlash when their influence becomes too brazen. The 2013 outcry over Wall Street's revolving door with the Treasury Department mirrored ancient resentments against viziers who blurred public and private interests. Even tech billionaires learning the hard way that data hoarding inspires rebellion echo Babylonian priests who overplayed their hand with celestial prophecies. What ancient and modern power brokers share is the illusion of inevitability. Whether it's a eunuch attributing policy to imperial will or a consultant presenting market forces as immutable laws, both disguise human agency as natural order. The real lesson across millennia isn't that power hides, it's that we're trained not to see it. When a congressional staffer drafts legislation shaped by industry talking points, or a platform's terms of service quietly redefine free speech, they're playing a game whose rules were written in cuneiform. The players change, the board remains. The Ming Dynasty's collapse wasn't written in battle cries or peasant uprisings. It was scribbled in the margins of Eunuch Zhongxian's secret ledgers. Once a minor palace servant with a knack for flattery, Why rose from polishing the emperor's chamber pots to controlling the entire bureaucracy, proving how easily a regime could be gutted from within. His ascent began with a simple advantage: access. As the favorite eunuch of the Chanki emperor's wet nurse, Wai mastered the art of whispering suggestions during chess games and slipping forged documents into late-night reading piles. Within years, he'd turned the imperial secretariat into his personal fiefdom, promoting officials who kissed his robes and executing those who dared mention his illiteracy. But Wai's real innovation was institutional sabotage. He didn't just corrupt the system, he weaponized its paperwork. Tax revenues mysteriously shrank as silver shipments vanished into his private warehouses. Military reports from the northern frontier were lost until after Manchu raids had overrun garrisons. When censors accused him of treason, Wei simply had their memorials redirected to his own desk, where he penned the emperor's dismissals himself. The genius of his scheme lay in its invisibility. Unlike a warlord's revolt, his takeover left the throne physically intact, just hollowed out like a gilded eggshell. The fallout was catastrophic. By the 1620s, the Ming military was starving while Wei's protégés auctioned officer commissions to the highest bidders. Provincial governors, terrified of his spy network, stopped sending accurate harvest reports, masking a famine that would eventually claim millions. Even the dynasty's famed porcelain trade became a smuggling operation, with Wei's allies skimming profits from Jingdezhen kilns. When the Zhongxian emperor finally took power and ordered Wei's arrest in 1627, the eunuch chose suicide, but his network lived on. The very bureaucrats trained in his shadow now struggled to govern without his backroom deals, leaving the regime staggering toward its fatal confrontation with peasant rebels and the Manchus. Wei's legacy exposes a paradox. The most destructive servants aren't those who rebel, but those who become indispensable. Like termites in a wooden palace, they don't smash walls. They quietly chew the beams until the roof caves in on everyone, themselves included. The Ming didn't fall to barbarians at the gates, but to the man who'd once been trusted to lock them. Byzantium's corridors of power were no strangers to eunuchs pulling strings from the shadows, but few dared to step fully into the light. John the Orphanotrophos didn't just whisper in emperors' ears. He became the empire's de facto ruler, proving that a man without a dynasty could still command one. Born into poverty, castrated as a child to secure a clerical career, John rose through the bureaucracy by mastering its most potent currency, information. As minister to Emperor Romanos III, he didn't just manage the treasury. He weaponized it, tracking every tax collector's skim and every general's payroll to build a web of blackmail. When Romanos died mysteriously after a bathhouse collapse conveniently just as he planned to replace John, the eunuch orchestrated the marriage of his brother Michael to the Empress Zoe, ensuring the new emperor would be his puppet. What made John's rule so revolutionary wasn't just his eunuch status, it was his blatant disregard for aristocratic pretenses. While nobles sneered at his mutilation, he staffed the bureaucracy with fellow eunuchs and low-born clerks, creating a shadow government loyal only to him. He drafted laws favoring merchant guilds over landowning elites, knowing trade routes were easier to tax than sprawling estates. When famine struck Anatolia, he didn't distribute grain through the church or aristocracy. He used imperial warehouses, ensuring peasants credited their survival to him, not God or local lords. This wasn't just administration, it was a masterclass in rewriting the social contract. Yet John's greatest power lay in his invisibility. He never sat on the throne, letting his brother Michael IV wear the crown while he controlled the machinery of state. When Michael's epilepsy made him unfit to rule, John simply shielded him from public view, issuing decrees in his name. Even as Michael's health deteriorated, John staged elaborate processions with the emperor propped up on horseback, his tremors hidden beneath jeweled robes. The court knew the truth, but John's grip on the Varangian Guard and the treasury made rebellion unthinkable. The backlash when it came was as ironic as it was brutal. John's downfall began with his own family, his nephew Michael V, whom he'd placed on the throne after his brother's death. The young emperor, tired of being a puppet, had John blinded and exiled to a monastery, only to be overthrown weeks later by a mob furious at his ingratitude. The tragedy wasn't just personal. It revealed the fragility of a system where power depended entirely on one man's cunning. Without John, the bureaucracy he'd built unraveled, his reforms overturned by aristocrats eager to reclaim their privileges. John's legacy forces us to rethink the boundaries of power. In a world obsessed with bloodlines and battle prowess, a eunuch with no children and no sword proved that real authority flows through ledgers, not lineages. His reign, though never official, demonstrated how easily the marginalized could become the architects of empires, provided they mastered the art of making themselves indispensable. And in that lesson lies a timeless warning. The most dangerous rulers aren't always the ones who sit on the throne. Sometimes they're the ones who quietly hold the pen that signs its decrees. The boardrooms of today and the throne rooms of antiquity share an uncanny resemblance, not in their decor, but in the invisible rules that govern them. Consider how a modern executive assistant controls access to the CEO, filtering meetings and emails with the same precision as a Ming Dynasty eunuch guarding the emperor's chambers. The tools have evolved from wax seals to Outlook calendars, but the principle remains unchanged. Proximity to power is power itself. A junior analyst who masters the art of the pre-read, curating data packets for leadership meetings, can shape decisions as effectively as a Byzantine scribe editing imperial decrees before they reach the emperor's desk. Media manipulation follows ancient blueprints with digital upgrades. The Abbasid caliphs employed poets to craft viral verses praising their reigns. Today's influencers are the new court bards trading likes for patronage. When a corporation faces scandal, its PR team doesn't burn incriminating documents. It floods search algorithms with positive content, mirroring how Tang Dynasty censors buried unflattering histories beneath layers of official chronicles. The Roman practice of planting favorable rumors in bathhouses finds its parallel in Twitter bots amplifying hashtags, both relying on the same human tendency to mistake repetition for truth. Soft power, too, wears contemporary disguises. Ancient Persia projected influence through gifts of exquisite tapestries and rare spices. Modern nations wield cultural exports like K-pop and Hollywood blockbusters. The Venetian Republic's ambassadors once secured trade deals by flattering Ottoman pashas with Murano glass. Now Silicon Valley wins concessions by offering tech hubs and coding academies. Even the Janissary's loyalty through privilege model echoes in today's corporate perk wars, where free gourmet meals and nap pods keep employees just comfortable enough to never question the hierarchy. Yet the most enduring lesson lies in fragility. The scribes who toppled the Abbasids by withholding records foreshadowed whistleblowers leaking emails to destabilize CEOs. The downfall of overreaching tax collectors like Rome's Publicani warns against modern lobbyists who push deregulation until systems collapse. History's silent architects teach us that power preserved too ruthlessly often sows its own destruction, whether it's a eunuch hoarding imperial edicts or a middle manager gatekeeping critical reports. The genius of these strategies isn't their complexity, but their adaptability. A medieval vizier redistributing land titles to allies would recognize the tactics of a VP reshuffling departments to consolidate control. The difference: today's players have LinkedIn profiles instead of royal decrees, yet the chessboard remains the same. Understanding these patterns doesn't just reveal how power works, it offers a choice: replicate the cycles of the past or break them. After all, the greatest advantage any servant ever held was knowing the game well enough to rewrite its rules. History remembers the kings, but it was the servants who often wrote the rules, then erased their fingerprints. From eunuchs to scribes, these silent architects remind us that power isn't always about crowns. Sometimes it's about who holds the pen, the purse, or the poison. Think about the last time you read a historical decree or marveled at an ancient monument. Chances are the hands that crafted those words or laid those stones belonged to someone whose name never made it into the textbooks. They worked in the margins, their influence seeping into history like ink into parchment, visible only if you know where to look. Take the example of the Vatican's papal scribes during the Renaissance. While popes claimed divine authority, it was these anonymous clerks who decided which petitions reached the throne and which were lost in bureaucratic limbo. A well-placed delay could bankrupt a rival city-state. A strategic edit in a treaty could redraw borders. Their power wasn't just in writing history, it was in controlling its tempo. Similarly, the treasury officials of medieval Europe, hunched over ledgers by candlelight, wielded more influence than most knights. A single stroke of their quills could divert funds from a war to a rival duke's pocket, starving armies without ever drawing a sword. And then there's the darker side of this hidden influence, the palace poisoners, the gardeners who knew which herbs could mimic illness, the food tasters who became experts in the art of survival. These figures operated in the blind spots of power, where a whispered warning or a strategically neglected duty could topple dynasties. The Borgias didn't rise to prominence solely through charisma. They had a network of apothecaries and kitchen staff who turned dinner parties into death sentences. Yet the most fascinating aspect of these shadow operators isn't their ruthlessness, it's their duality. The same scribe who doctored records to protect a king might later leak them to undermine a tyrant. The eunuch who amassed wealth through graft could also be the one funding orphanages to secure his legacy. Power in their hands was never static. It was a tool, a weapon, and sometimes a shield, depending on the moment. This brings us to the unsettling question. If servants could shape empires from the shadows, who's doing it today? Look around. The executive assistant who filters a CEO's emails, the algorithm engineer tweaking a social media feed, the mid-level bureaucrat drafting regulations. They're the modern equivalents of history's silent architects. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same. Influence doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Often, it's the quiet click of a keyboard or the deliberate pause before a reply. So the next time you hear about a sudden resignation, a baffling policy shift, or a corporate scandal that no one saw coming, remember, someone did. They just weren't in the spotlight, and that's the enduring lesson of these unsung strategists. Real power isn't about who takes the credit, but who controls the gears. If this hidden history fascinates you, imagine what else we've overlooked. Who do you think holds the real power today? The answer might be closer and far more ordinary.